What's up everybody? In this video we're going to look at Chiron midpoint historical applications, solar arc and lunar direction techniques on midpoints, secondary progressions, and perfected midpoints. I've made previous volumes, check them out, with peace and love. We're going over archetypal vectors, midpoints, malefics, and ingress case studies, historical Chiron Saturn, Chiron Neptune, Chiron Pluto, and Chiron Uranus midpoints, solar arc directed midpoints, lunar arc and tertiary directions, secondary progressed midpoints, annual perfections of midpoint structures, tight orb event correlation, running footnotes, supplements and appendices. Continue watching with peace and love, and I was able to use Grok AI to help craft these PDF, also report labs. So here's this abstract we're going to go over. So volume 3 here extends the tight orb midpoint methodology of the preceding monographs into two specialized domains. So first it reconstructs the historical behavior of Chiron midpoints, Chiron Saturn, Chiron Neptune, Chiron Pluto, Chiron Uranus, across the modern period, demonstrating their distinctive correlation with collective loan, institutional response, and healing architecture events. Second, it investigates the application of symbolic direction and progression techniques, solar arc, lunar directions, secondary progressions, annual profections to midpoint structures themselves. The central claim is that a midpoint may be treated as a sensitive point and directed, progressed, or profected under the same orb protocols. So lesser than 1 degrees activation, lesser than 2 degrees applying malefic contact, already validated for natal and transit work. Worked historical examples and prospective applications to 2025 through 2035 corridor are supplied throughout. There's also going to be footnotes, technical appendices, and pedagogical supplements, and they're going to complete the apparatus. So keywords here in this video are Chiron midpoints, solar arc directions, lunar arc, secondary progressions, profections, directed midpoints, and collective loon dynamics. Alright, so in this video we're looking at Chiron as midpoint partner, theoretical foundations, historical applications of Chiron Saturn midpoints, Chiron Neptune, Chiron Pluto, and Chiron Uranus midpoints in history, solar arc directions applied to midpoints, lunar directions and tertiary techniques on midpoint structures, secondary progressions of midpoints, perfected midpoints, so annual and multi-year activation. Integrated case studies are combining transit, arc, progression, and profection. Prospective applications of the 2025 through 2035 corridor. Appendix A is going to be Chiron midpoint chronology, 1920 through 2040. Appendix B is computational protocols for directed and progressed midpoints, as well as Appendix C works solar arc and progression examples. Supplement 1 is seminar exercises, and Supplement 2 is methodological limits and open questions, and then we'll have some endnotes. So let's get straight into this video. There's a lot to go over. So Chiron as midpoint partner. These are the theoretical foundations. Chiron's 50.7-year orbit and extreme eccentricity produce sign durations that range from roughly 1 year Libra to 8 years, which is Aries. And Chiron forms a midpoint with Saturn, Neptune, Pluto, or Uranus. The resulting sensitive point carries a distinctive signature, the balloon that seeks structural, emotional, transformative, or disruptive resolution. Under the tight orb protocol, retained from volumes 1 and 2, lesser than 1 degrees activation by third body or angle, also lesser than 2 degrees applying malefic major aspect. Chiron midpoints prove historically discriminated for events of collective injury, institutional response, the architecture of healing, or compensation. We see primary Chiron midpoint families, and notice that we're going over Chiron Saturn, Chiron Neptune, Chiron Pluto, Chiron Uranus, because these 4 families are not exhaustive, yet they account for the majority of high-resolution historical correlations recovered under the tight orb filter. The present volume therefore concentrates upon them, while leaving secondary pairings, like Chiron Jupiter, Chiron Mars, etc., for later investigation. So Chiron Saturn is the wound of structure and a structure of the wound, collective experiences of insufficiency, demand, institutional or legal response, crystallization of care regimes, disability frameworks, pension systems, and ecological limits. Chiron Neptune is the wound of the ideal and the idealization of the wound, mythologies of victimhood or redemption, the sacralization of suffering, the emergence of new healing narratives that make themselves become sources of further injury if unexamined. Chiron Pluto, the wound that transforms power and the power that transforms wound, compulsory exposure of hidden injury, the redistribution of agency through crises, the shadow side of therapeutic or revolutionary movements. Chiron Uranus, the wound of disruption and the disruption of the wound, sudden collective shocks that open new cognitive or technological pathways to healing or to further fragmentation, the nervous system of the collective under informational overload. So, Chiron's discoveries in 1977 and subsequent integration into astrological practice do not preclude retrospective application. The body occupied the same longitudes whether or not it was known. The methodological test is correlated performance, not contemporary awareness. Right, historical applications of Chiron Saturn midpoints. Chiron Saturn midpoint is the most consistently documented of the four families. Its activations cluster around moments when collective material or bodily insufficiency forces the invention or reform of institutional containers. So in 1929 through 1933, there's depression and the birth of new social contracts. During Chiron's first modern Taurus transit, Chiron Saturn midpoint, it repeatedly fell under tight activation by outer planet stations and by Mars. So the morphological match is precise. Collapse of prior economic security wound met by the experimental construction of welfare state and regulatory architectures, Saturnian response. The New Deal, comparable European measures, and the parallel rise of authoritarian solutions all register as different institutional answers to the same midpoint pressure. Exact stations of Saturn, relative to the midpoint in 1931 through 32, mark the inflection from pure crises to constructive or coercive response. And we see 1979 through 1983, stagflation, oil shock, and neoliberal restructuring. So Chiron again in Taurus, and Saturn moving through Virgo, Libra, and Scorpio. Chiron Saturn midpoint received multiple less than 1 degrees activations during the second oil shock and the Volcker recession. The wound of energy and monetary sufficiency met by a radical re-engineering of the relationship between state, market, and individual risk. The midpoint reading does not privilege any single policy outcome. It identifies the archetypal necessity of structural response to a perceived collective insufficiency. In 2008 through 2012, we see financial crises and the renegotiation of security, although Chiron occupied Aquarius and Pisces during the acute phase. Chiron, Saturn, midpoint, Saturn, then in Virgo, Libra, was repeatedly activated by Pluto's Capricorn ingress and by the Saturn-Uranus opposition. So the morphological signature is systemic exposure of hidden leverage wound, followed by emergency institutional invention. Saturn recapitulates the earlier Taurus cycle patterns under a different sign emphasis. The tight orb filter again isolates the temporal nodes of maximum legislative and central bank response. Perspective. Chiron Saturn under the 2026 to 2033 Taurus transit, with Chiron re-entering Taurus and Saturn in Aries, later Taurus. The Chiron Saturn midpoint will occupy early Aries degrees for several years, precisely the zone already identified by Saturn Neptune and Uranus Pluto midpoints we talked about in previous videos. The historical pattern predicts a renewed confrontation with questions of material sufficiency, bodily integrity, and the right to exist without continuous productive justification, together with institutional and mythic responses of corresponding weight. Exact midpoint activations by outer planet stations in 2027 through 30 warrant the highest research priority. So midpoint longitudes are constructed from Swiss ephemeris event chronologies from standard economic histories of the Depression. 2008 through 09 activations are cross-referenced with Saturn, Uranus, and Pluto analysis of Volume 2, Appendix C. Alright, Chiron Neptune, Chiron Pluto, Chiron Uranus, midpoints in history. Chiron Neptune, the wound of the ideal. So activations of the Chiron Neptune midpoint correlate with the emergence or collapse of collective healing myths. So the 1917 through 20 period, where Chiron was in Aries Taurus, its Neptune in Leo, produced both the sacralization of revolutionary suffering and the Wilsonian ideal of collective security, two imaginal responses to civilizational wound. The 1987 through 90 window, Chiron in Cancer Leo, Neptune in Capricorn, saw the dissolution of the Soviet myth and a brief idealization of a new world order. In each case, the midpoint, when tightly activated, marks the moment when a prior ideal is revealed as inadequate to the wound it claimed to heal, or when a new ideal crystallizes around an unhealed injury. Chiron Pluto, compulsory exposure of hidden injury. So, the Chiron Pluto midpoint organizes events in which previously occulted collective wounds are forced into visibility and simultaneously become sites of power struggle. The early AIDS crisis under the 1980s Saturn-Pluto conjunction and Chiron's Gemini-Cancer passage supplies a paradigmatic instance. This is very important. Gemini-Cancer, as well as that Saturn-Pluto conjunction. So the wound here is, of course, bodily, sexual, social. It's both exposed and contested as a locus of political and medical authority. Similar dynamics appear in the truth and reconciliation processes of the 1990s and in the more recent wave of institutional abuse revelations. Tight activations convert latent knowledge into irreversible public fact. Chiron, Uranus. Shock in the nervous system of the collective, So Chiron Uranus midpoints mark sudden informational or technological shocks that open or further wound collective cognitive pathways. The 1940s computational and cryptographic revolution under Chiron in Leo, Virgo, and Uranus in Gemini, and the early internet's expansion under Chiron in Libra and Uranus in Aquarius. These both show the pattern, not both, but all of these. A wound of disconnection or ignorance meets a disruptive technological response that itself generates new forms of fragmentation. The current Uranus in Gemini, Chiron in Taurus period places their midpoint in early Aries. So, again, inside the multi-body resonance zone of 2025 through 35, predicting further shocks to the collective nervous system around questions of value, embodiment, and informational sovereignty. Chiron up to midpoint longitudes and outer planet activations verified against specific decided intervals. The AIDS crisis correlation is one of the strongest modern illustrations of Chiron-Pluto under simultaneous Saturn-Pluto pressure. Comparative analysis of 3 modern Chiron-Uranus midpoint eras, 40s, 90s, 2020s, is recommended as a seminar exercise. Alright, let's do solar arc directions applied to midpoints. So, solar arc direction, it advances every natal factor, including midpoints, by the arc of the secondary progressed sun. The technique is therefore capable of moving a natal midpoint to exact contact with a natal planet, angle, or another midpoint at a predictable adult age. Under the tight orb protocol, the directed midpoint is treated as an event organizer when it reaches less than 1 degree of a sensitive point, especially when the contact is applying and involves a malefic. So here's the computational protocol. Compute the natal midpoint. This formula here. And we see M equals A plus B divided by 2, the shorter arc, and then compute the solar arc for the targeted date, progressed sun longitude minus the natal sun longitude. Add the arc to M to obtain the directed midpoint, so MSA, and inspect contacts of MSA to natal planets, angles and other midpoints within 1 degrees, not 1 point, 1 degrees. Note whether any malefic is applying to MSA within 2 degrees, and then correlate surviving contacts with biographical or historical chronology. Here we see the solar arc midpoint protocol summary. Natal midpoint computed under shorter arc convention. Solar arc equals SP, sun subtracting natal sun, degree for year. Directed midpoint equals natal midpoint, adding the solar arc. Activation orb lesser than 1 degree, applying malefic is going to be lesser than 2 degrees. And primary use is adult life timing of midpoint themes. I really enjoy using AI. I don't care who gets mad and says they hate it. This is really, really helpful for people that have trouble reading and also have trouble retaining information. So it could be good for a lot of things. It doesn't have to be nefarious. But yeah, historical illustration. Directed Chiron Saturn in the collective chart. Taking the United States Sibley chart as a test case, we see that the natal Chiron Saturn midpoint, directed by solar arc, it reached the exact contact with the natal Pluto in the mid-1930s, and actually again by converse and direct arcs near the 2008 through 09 crises. In both instances, the morphological match, collective material moon meeting structural and plutonian response is consistent with the transit analysis of sections 2 and 3. So the solar arc method therefore supplies an independent, age-specific confirmation of the same archetypal complex. And prospects. For any national or institutional chart whose natal Chiron, Saturn, Chiron, Neptune, or Uranus, Pluto midpoint currently lies within 20 degrees to 30 degrees of a sensitive point, solar arc direction will perfect the contact during the coming decade. Researchers are encouraged to pre-compute these arcs and to monitor the exact years against the transit activations already identified in volumes 1 and 2. Convergence of solar arc and transit triggers on the same midpoint constitutes the highest probability event signature under the combined protocol. So, solar arc methodology, it follows a standard degree for year convention. The innovation of the present volume is a systematic application of the technique to midpoints rather than the planets alone. And simply chart data and solar arc calculations are reproducible from any competent ephemeris package. Results should be rechecked with primary sources. Alright, lunar directions and the tertiary techniques on midpoint structures. Alright guys, so lunar directions and the related tertiary progressions move factors by the arc of the moon rather than the sun. Because the moon's daily motion is approximately 13 times the sun's, lunar arcs produce a finer temporal grain useful for isolating weeks or months within a broader solar arc or transit window. When applied to midpoint, the technique yields high-resolution timing of already identified sensitive points. So the method here is two related procedures are employed. The first is lunar arc direction. The arc of the secondary progressed moon is added to the natal midpoint. Tertiary progression, each day after birth is equated to 1 lunar month. The resulting positions are inspected for midpoint contacts. In both cases, the lesser than 1 degree's activation orb is retained because lunar motion is rapid. Only applying contacts of very tight orb are retained for event correlation. Historical micro-timing example. So within the broader 2008 solar arc and transit window, lunar arc directions of the relevant national Chiron, Saturn, and Saturn-Uranus midpoints perfected within days of the Lehman filing and the subsequent legislative responses. The lunar technique does not replace the solar or transit analysis. It sharpens the temporal focus from the year to the week, confirming that the midpoint remained the organizing sensitive point at the moment of maximum collective pressure. The same micro-timing protocol is recommended for the exact Saturn-Neptune conjunction passes and Uranus-Pluto trine stations of 2026 through 2028. Once the solar arc and transit windows are established, lunar directions of the key midpoints can isolate the highest probability days or weeks. So lunar arc and tertiary methods are classical. Their systematic application of midpoints under a strict orb filter is a contribution of the present volume. And micro-timing results are sensitive to the exact birth time of the national chart employed. Alternative charting traditions should be tested in parallel. Alrighty. Secondary progressions of midpoints. Secondary progressions, day for a year, move every natal factor, including midpoints, at the rate of the secondary progressed moon and planets. A progressed midpoint may therefore form exact aspects to natal or progressed planets and angles at predictable ages. This is very important. So, if you've never seen this done before, let's listen up because this is very, very cool to me. I mean, if you want to learn astrology, here you go. Form exact aspects to the natal or the progressed planets. And we're showing you exactly how to do it. Angles at predictable ages. The tight orb protocol again supplies a filter, so only less than 1 degree's contacts, especially applying malefic ones, are retained for interpretation. In computational steps, progress the 2 planets to the target age day for a year, then recompute the midpoint from the progressed longitudes, or alternatively progress the natal midpoint itself by the progressed sun or moon. Progress the natal midpoint itself by the arc of the progressed sun or progressed moon. And both methods are tested. Holy shit, I keep talking over myself. I'm just so excited to talk about astrology. I gotta slow down. Also, it just feels like, as a Gen Z, time's running out, so I'm trying to get my videos out. So I can grow my audience, but yeah. Anywho, inspect contacts to the natal and the progressed vectors within 1 degree. Correlate with biography or collective chronology. The 2 computational routes are going to be progressed planets versus directed midpoint, and these usually converge within 1 degree. Discrepancies larger than 1 degree are flagged for further scrutiny. And collective illustration. We see progressed Chiron Saturn midpoints in national charts repeatedly perfect contacts to the natal Pluto, or the angles during periods of institutional reform following collective trauma. 1930s, 1960s, 70s, 2009 through 2012. The progressed technique therefore supplies an independent confirmation of the same midpoint structure, organizes both the acute crises, transit, solar arc, and the longer developmental response, secondary progression for the 2025 through 2035 corridor, as well as progressed midpoints of major national charts. These should be pre-computed and compared with the transit and solar arc triggers already identified. So here we see secondary progression of midpoints is a natural extension of standard progressed technique. The strict orb filter is required to avoid overdetermination, and researchers should maintain parallel calculations for at least 2 national chart traditions, for example, Sibley and alternative US charts, to test robustness. So here we go, perfected midpoints, and we're talking about annual and multi-year activations. So annual perfection advances the ascendant or any chosen point by 1 sign per year. When the perfected ascendant or a perfected planet reaches a sign or degree of a natal midpoint, that midpoint is considered activated for the perfected year. The technique is especially used for isolating which of several natal midpoints will be thematically foregrounded in a given year, and for coordinating that emphasis with transit, solar arc, and progression triggers. So here's a protocol for midpoint perfection. We're identifying the natal midpoints of interest, so usually Chiron, Saturn, Uranus, Pluto, etc., and then perfect the ascendant or the midpoint itself by whole sign or degree for year methods. Note the years in which a perfected vector enters a sign or exact degree of a natal midpoint. Cross-reference those years with transit and solar arc activations of the same midpoint. Years of multiple convergence, so perfection, adding transit, adding solar arc, receives the highest research priority. And historical and prospective application. We see in the US Sibley chart, perfections of the Chiron Saturn midpoint and of the ascendant into the midpoint sign coincide with several of the major institutional response years already recovered by transit and solar arc methods. So early 1930s, late 1970s, early 1980s, 2009 through 2011. Looking forward, the same perfection technique isolates specific years within this corridor when natal midpoints of major national charts will be annually emphasized, allowing researchers to anticipate which collective wound or structural theme is likely to dominate public discourse in a given year. So perfection is a classical timing technique. Its systematic application of midpoints under a multi-technique convergence protocol is original to this series. Whole sign and degree-based perfection should be calculated. Convergence of 2 methods strengthens the signal. We see integrated case studies. We're going to look at combining transit, arc, progression, and perfection. Alright, so the highest confidence event signatures arise when 4 independent techniques, being your transit, solar arc, secondary progression, and perfection, converge on the same midpoint within a narrow temporal window. 2 condensed case studies illustrate the combined protocol. So first, let's look at 2008 through 2009, the financial crisis multi-technique convergence. you'll notice the transit first, which is Saturn Uranus, opposition, and Pluto Capricorn ingress, activating relevant midpoints within 1 through 2 degrees. We see a solar arc, and that is directed Chiron Saturn and Saturn Uranus midpoints, perfecting contacts to natal Pluto, and the angles. Secondary progression, we see progressed midpoints applying to natal malefics, profection, annual emphasis on the signs of the key midpoints. So the fourfold convergence isolates 2008 through 9 as a maximum probability window for systemic exposure of hidden leverage and emergency institutional response, the exact historical morphology observed. And now 1930 through 33, depression response multi-technique convergence here. MTC. Full computational worksheets for both case studies appear in Appendix C. Researchers are invited to replicate and extend the calculations. Transit Chiron Saturn midpoint under repeated outer planet activation. Solar arc directed midpoints contacting natal Pluto and the angles. Progression, so secondary progressive factors reinforcing the same axes. And perfection, annual emphasis on the relevant signs. So again, the combined protocol recovers the historical interval of maximum institutional invention under conditions of collective material wound. The methodological implication is clear. No single technique is sufficient. The research standard for the present series is multi-technique convergence under tight orbs. Isolated transit or arc hits remain suggestive, and fourfold convergence is treated as historically discriminative. Alright, and just make sure here, we're going to look at the prospective applications, and then, yeah, we have, just making sure we got the supplements in there as well. Okay, so for prospective applications for this corridor, transit environment here, Saturn, Neptune, and Aries, Uranus, Gemini, Pluto, and Aquarius, Chiron, Taurus, already identifies early Aries midpoints. You see solar arc directions of natal Chiron, Saturn, Uranus, Pluto, and Saturn, Neptune midpoints, and major national charts will perfect contacts during the same decade. Secondary progressions and annual profections will further isolate specific years. The combined protocol therefore predicts a multi-year interval of elevated probability for collective events organized around the archetype complex already identified. So that's initiated identity under idealization, informational disruption, value rune activation, and the network power transformation. Research agenda for the coming decade: pre-compute solar arc progressed and perfected positions of all key midpoints for at least 5 major national charts. Maintain a running transit log of less than 1 degrees midpoint activations and less than 2 degrees applying malefic aspects. Flag every instance of multi-technique convergence. Correlate quarterly with documented collective events. Publish both positive and negative findings. Only through such disciplined prospective work can the claims of the present series be confirmed, refined, or falsified. So we see that a midpoint is not a static symbol, it is a moving sensitive point. When transit, arc, progression, and profection converge upon it, the collective is invited to confrontation whose timing can be known in advance and whose morphology can be recognized in retrospect. The historians and the astrologers' tasks meet at that convergence. Alright, our first appendix here we're going to look at is Chiron midpoint chronology. Selected intervals of elevated Chiron midpoint activity under the tight orb filter. Full degree level is reserved for the digital research supplement. So we see the interval dominant midpoints in historical morphology, so 1929 through 33, Chiron Saturn Taurus cycle. Depression, welfare state invention, 1940 through 45, Chiron Uranus, Chiron Pluto. Wartime computational medical mobilization. 1979 through 83, Chiron Saturn, Chiron Pluto, stagflation, early A's, neoliberal turn. 1987 through 90, Chiron Neptune, collapse of Soviet myths, New World Order. 2008 through 2012, Chiron Saturn under Pluto Uranus, financial crises, emergency institutions. And 2026 through 2033, Chiron Saturn, Chiron Neptune, Chiron Uranus, Aries zone, prospective value moon under multi-body resonance. Okay, Appendix B is computational protocols for directed and progressed midpoints. So we see the solar arc, MSA equals M natal, adding SP sun, subtracting natal sun, activation less than 1 degrees, applying malefic less than 2 degrees. Lunar arc MLA equals M natal, adding SP moon, subtracting natal moon, and the same orbs used for macrotiming inside broader windows. Secondary progression of midpoint, either progress both parent planets and recompute the midpoint, or advance natal midpoint by SP sun or SP moon arc discrepancies greater than 1 degree flagged. And perfection, whole sign or degree for year advance of ascendant or of the midpoint itself. Years of sign degree contact with natal midpoints isolated and cross-checked against other techniques. All calculations employ the shorter arc midpoint convention and the tight orb filter of volumes 1 through 2. Software implementation should be validated against independent ephemerides. In Appendix C, arced solar arc and progression examples. So, solar arc direction of a national Chiron center midpoint to the natal Pluto in the mid-1930s. Depression response window, exact arc and orb data reproducible from the Sibley chart in Swiss ephemeris. Morphological match to institutional invention under collective material wound is consistent with transit findings. Secondary progressed Chiron Saturn midpoint applying to the natal angles, 2009 through 2011. Post-crisis regulatory response, again a progressed contact reinforces the transit in solar arc signatures already documented. Perspective here is solar arc and progressed positions of key midpoints for 2026 through 2030 should be pre-computed for major national charts and lodged in the research archive before the exact transit stations occur, allowing genuine prospective testing. And here are the supplements. First supplement is seminar exercises. Recompute one historical Chiron Saturn midpoint. Activation from section 2 using primary ephemerides, verify orb and morphological match. And proceed to calculate the solar arc direction of a chosen national chart Chiron Saturn midpoint for the period and identify exact years of contact. Apply lunar arc microtiming to one exact Saturn-Neptune conjunction pass of 2026 through 2027. Perfect the same midpoint and note years of annual emphasis. Present a multi-technique convergence analysis for a single year inside the corridor, including explicit negative findings and methodological limits and open questions. So, directed and progressed midpoints. Inherit all the uncertainties of the underlying national or institutional charts. Birth time, relocation, alternative charting traditions. Lunar arc microtiming is especially sensitive to time accuracy. We see that perfections admit both whole sign and degree-based variance. The present series treats multi-technique convergence under tight orbs as the strongest available signal, yet acknowledges that even for full convergence remains correlative, not causal. Open questions include the relative weight of converse arcs, the behavior of midpoints under tertiary progressions of longer range, and the performance of the protocol in non-Western national charts. These questions are recommended for subsequent research. And the endnotes here, retrospective application of Chiron is justified by correlative performance under the same orb protocols applied to the other outer bodies. Discovery date is epistemologically irrelevant to the test. Economic and institutional chronologies drawn from standard histories, midpoint longitudes from Swiss ephemeris. Chiron Neptune, Chiron Pluto, and Chiron Uranus correlations are offered as morphological patterns, not exhaustive surveys. Further case collection is encouraged. Solar arc application to midpoints is a principal technical innovation of sections 4 through 5. And we see, not 4 through 5, 4 through 6. Actually, 4 through, I'm tweaking. I'm bad at Roman numerals. I usually forget those. Classical solar arc doctrine is assumed known, so lunar arc and tertiary methods are classical. Microtiming results require high birth time accuracy. Yep, we're locked in now. Secondary progression of midpoints. It follows naturally from standard progressed technique, dual computational routes, parents versus midpoint arc. These are recommended for robustness. We see perfection of midpoints as a natural extension of classical annual perfection. Both whole sign and degree methods should be retained. Multi-technique convergence is proposed as a research standard for the series. Isolated hits remain suggestive only. Prospective research design is essential. Post hoc fitting alone cannot validate the protocol. In general, all midpoint calculations employ the shorter arc convention and the less than 1 degrees divided by less than 2 degrees orb filter volumes 1 and 2. Independent replication is invited. I will see you guys in the next video teaching more astrology for free. Piscean out.